Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. November is Remembrance Month. We wear poppies and we think of the fallen from the First World War and the many wars since, and think of all those who serve in Canada's defence. We honor these Canadians on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month each year. And this year is a special year. It marks the 100th anniversary of the poppy. But with the second year of COVID-19 and its related lockdowns, and now with vaccine passports, how will this year's Remembrance commemorations be honored, if at all? Already, we are hearing of Remembrance Day parades being canceled for the second year in a row, and limitations on crowd sizes at some outdoor memorials. And of course, there is the drama ensuing about raising the Canadian flags back to full mast for Remembrance Day. Recall that the flags on all federal buildings have been lowered since May 30th, following the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. Prime Minister Trudeau said that they would not be raised again until, and I quote, "We have worked enough with Indigenous communities and leadership to make a clear determination that it was time to raise them again and continue the hard work of reconciliation." But what of Remembrance Day? Will the flag be raised or lowered for the fallen soldiers in time for November 11th? How will we do justice by our veterans and men and women in uniform in the midst of COVID? Remember, thousands upon thousands of Canadians died for our freedom, and their sacrifice cannot go unacknowledged. Well, joining me later in the program to share his knowledge on the history of the Great War, Canada's sacrifice, and remembrance in general is author, filmmaker, and writer John Robson. But joining me now to share how Canadian vets and the public in general will be, or ought to be, commemorating Remembrance Day is Stephen Clark, National Executive Director of the Royal Canadian Legion. Thank you, Mr. Clark, for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, it's such an important topic and in such an important time in our calendar year. So please share with us, how will this year's Remembrance commemorations take place?
We are hoping for ceremonies to be more reminiscent of what they were like pre-pandemic. Now, as you had mentioned, we still have to observe whatever restrictions or limitations that are in place locally, but we are hoping that it will allow for an expanded ceremony. So, for example, if I can take the national ceremony downtown, the Legion organizes that ceremony, and we had planned for a very restricted ceremony. And in fact, we're encouraging people to watch from home as opposed to being on site.
And this is when you said downtown, meaning downtown Ottawa or the National Memorial?
Absolutely, yes, downtown Ottawa, the National War Memorial. With the recent decision by the Ontario government allowing greater presence by spectators, we can now have crowds closer to what we had normally had in the past. But we still have restrictions we have to observe. We still want people to maintain that physical distancing, and we still require people to wear masks. And that is going to be played out all across the country where ceremonies are allowed to be held in person.
Okay. So, we talked a little bit about how this year's restrictions might be in place due to COVID. Maybe you can share with Canadians how last year's, even last year's and this year's events in general have been impacted by the COVID restrictions, how the commemorations. For example, I mentioned in my opener, parades don't seem to be happening as often. Will there be a parade somewhere in the country? What have you heard?
It is unlikely that parades will be happening across the country, unfortunately. A major part of commemorations is the Veterans Parade, and it is so inspiring to see these veterans march by and they receive the adulation of the crowds that are there gathered to pay respects to the fallen and to those who had served. We're not able to do that this year. It doesn't mean that Canadians are forgetting, that they are not remembering any less. It's just that we don't have that visual presence that we normally had in the past. It's unfortunate, but it is something that we have to make sure that we observe, and we anticipate that in 2022, things will be different.
Now, I was so happy to see just a few days ago, I went to the local hardware store and I saw two representatives of the Legion, of the Canadian Legion, selling poppies. We didn't have this last year. So I was so excited, I ran to my car to get some money and bought a few. So I was happy to see that. So is it fair to say that a lot of the acceptance of donations in lieu of poppies are out and about again this year?
Absolutely. That is returning. This year already, we have over 34,000 physical locations where Canadians can go in across the country and be able to make a donation to receive their poppy.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on Remembrance Day commemorations, and joining me again is Stephen Clark, National Executive Director of the Royal Canadian Legion. Stephen, the poppy is such a beautiful symbol of peace, of freedom, of sacrifice. It's the 100th anniversary this year. Many people may not be aware of that. Can you please tell us why that is so important?
Absolutely. 1921 is when the poppy was first adopted as a symbol of remembrance in Canada. It was presented by a woman from France who came to be known as the Poppy Lady from France. Her name, Madame Anna Guérin, who had an inter-allied Poppy Day scheme idea that she presented to countries all throughout the empire. And her goal was to raise money for veterans who had served in the First World War, as well to raise money for children, orphans in war-torn areas of France. It was so important that this idea be proposed, and wonderful that it was accepted. And Tanya, for the last 100 years, the Legion has been making poppies available to Canadians right across the country since then. It's an absolutely wonderful visual display of remembrance that every Canadian can take part in.
And I didn't even realize that the roots of the poppy tradition, if you will, came from France. I mean, so many, tens of thousands more Canadians lost their lives on those beaches in France and on the coast of France. So how apropos. There has been some concern about the flag at half-mast. And it's a sensitive topic, but I do want to address it. As many Canadians may be aware, due to the events with respect to the Indigenous children being found in unmarked graves, the flags have been lowered. And there was a little bit of a debate, if I can say, about whether the flag should be raised back, or if they should be remaining low for Remembrance Day. Can you please share with us what's going on with the flag for Remembrance Day?
Absolutely. The Legion was absolutely heartbroken when we learned about the horrific and tragic discovery of unmarked graves earlier this year. And in fact, we as an organization directed that all of our Legion branches lower their flags to half-staff for a period of official mourning and recognition. Mm-hmm. We have to remember as well that there are reasons why the Canadian flag is treated as it is. And one of those reasons for half-masting a Canadian flag is to also pay tribute to the 118,000 Canadians who have fallen in the military service of Canada. So how do you do that while still respecting why the Canadian flag is currently in the half-mast position? So that's why last Friday, the Legion sent out a information to all of our branches across the country saying, for those ceremonies on November 11th, if the Canadian flag is at your branch or at the cenotaph location, we want to make sure that we pay proper respect to those fallen Canadians. So at the start of the day, we will raise the flag, as we will at the national ceremony downtown Ottawa. Mm-hmm. We will lower the flag in the course of the ceremony as it progresses. It will be returned to half-staff, and then for the rest of the day, once the ceremony concludes, will be returned to that half-staff position. So this way, we do give proper recognition to all those who have fallen in the military service of the country. The veterans, the organization realizes that there's a reason the flags are at half-mast, but we also want to make sure that we do pay proper respects to our fallen, and this is one way to do it to both.
Now, not all Canadians may be in a position to attend in person to a Remembrance Day commemoration. For those persons who are not able to come in person, and of course I encourage everybody who is able to do so, how do you recommend, or how does the Legion recommend that they honor the fallen on November 11th?
There's three things I can think of, Tanya, that I would certainly recommend. The first is, if you cannot attend a ceremony in person, perhaps you can watch it online or through the Facebook live stream. If you're not able to do that, then perhaps at some point during the day, you go to your local cenotaph, you take your poppy and you place it at the base of the cenotaph as a very personal expression of remembrance. That way, as you are able to, you can do that. If you're simply not able to do that as well, then what we would ask at 11 a.m. please simply pause for 2 minutes of silence. And that is a wonderful tribute to the fallen.
Beautiful. And if people want more information on where they can, catch these live streams or a listing of where these events will take place, or just to learn a little bit more about Remembrance Day in general, where do you recommend that they go?
I would suggest they go to legion.ca. There they will find out all kinds of information on the history of the poppy, the wearing of the poppy, anything poppy FAQ that you might possibly have. But there's also a ceremony locator. So put in the name of your town or your municipality. It will return to you where your local ceremony is being held, so that if you are able to go down and attend in person, you'll know exactly what to do then.
Stephen Clark, thank you so much for your time. Well, joining us now to share his knowledge of the Great War, Canada's sacrifice, and remembrance in general is author, filmmaker, and writer John Robson. John, thank you so much for joining me again.
Good to be here.
So maybe you could help inform us and inform our viewers. What is Canada's legacy with World War I, with the Great War?
Canada's legacy in the Great War, I think, is both more important than is usually appreciated and considerably different. I mean, we all know about In Flanders Fields, but it's often portrayed as being a pacifist poem, a declaration that war is never worth it. And that's quite a mistaken view. It laments the loss. It was written because of the death of McCrae's close friend, but it is also a call to take up the torch. Very much to you, from failing hands we throw the torch, take up our quarrel with the foe.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about this in my documentary toward the end too. If you go to the Vimy Memorial, which anyone who gets the chance definitely should do, you see that at the top you have peace and justice. And without justice, there is no such thing as a meaningful peace. And then faith and honor, that the war. And again, people talk about the fact that Canada came of age at Vimy Ridge and in the war, and you think to yourself, but came of age as what? Not a conscientious objector, not as a pacifist, but as a nation that could and would shoulder its responsibilities when freedom was threatened. And people, that's another aspect of the war that's overshadowed, partly because I think the menace of Hitler in World War II and then Stalin in the Cold War was so appalling, so demonic, that people tend to think of World War I as a misunderstanding or a clash of empires. And it wasn't that. It was a bid by Kaiser Wilhelm to take over the world. And it would have been a very unpleasant world if he'd succeeded. And Canada poured out blood and treasure along with its allies in order to preserve an open world, a world of free speech, of democratic elections, and of social inclusion. Some things that happened back then, of course, don't meet our current standards, and in some respects, rightly not. But another thing that I remember very much about the filming the documentary, of course, we went to Vimy, and Vimy is where Canada came of age because the Canadian Corps fought together as one for the first time. But serendipity, we happened to find the Portuguese war cemetery by accident. I didn't actually know Portugal had been in the war. And from there, we saw the Indian War Memorial. And that's at Neuve-Chapelle in France, because that's the first place that the Indians fought together as one unit.
Wow.
And that is... that people, and they were all volunteers from India, that people had come from the other side of the world, because it somehow, without always knowing a whole lot about the details, they knew that there was an important principle at stake here. And so Canada's legacy in the war is having played a critical role in preventing the conquest of freedom by tyranny. And also, as I say in the documentary, of coming of age as men of the West, to borrow a phrase from Lord of the Rings. Now we'd say men and women of the West. And
right.
Yes, but that we found our identity as a Western nation, as a nation that stood in the proud line of defense of freedom going back to Magna Carta and beyond. And that, to me, in addition to the individual, the loss and the suffering and the extraordinarily horrifying conditions that I think combat always represents, but especially in that war, I remember not just that they endured these things, and some of them, of course, paid the ultimate price, but that they did it in the name of freedom. And that is why it's important that we should indeed take up their quarrel with the foe. It's something, again, if you're German, it's awfully hard to look at the war and see all that sacrifice and know that it was for nothing, or worse than nothing. but here it was justified.
And some of our, some viewers may not be familiar with the numbers out of the Great War. I mean, it was a very lethal and bloody war. How many Canadians' lives were lost in that war?
More Canadians were killed in the First World War than in the Second, as a matter of fact, and from a smaller population. And something like 1 in 10 Canadians put on a uniform in both World Wars. But in the First World War, Canada had more than 60,000 killed.
Wow.
Though a surprising footnote, the United States lost more. The United States had over 100,000 men killed in the war. But Canada had 60,000. And another interesting aspect of it, something like a quarter of all our casualties were in the final 100 days. After the Great Offensive in August of 1918 broke the German lines, the war of movement and of pursuit. And people think of the war as having been sort of a Blackadder-ish affair of mindless slaughter in the trenches, but it wasn't. It was a dynamic war that got bogged down and then ended up becoming again a war of mobility with new technology and new techniques.
Right.
But Canada had horrendous losses in 1918.
I got to stop you here. We got to cut to commercial, but I want to continue this in just a few moments.
Okay.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion with author, filmmaker, and writer John Robson. John, before we went to break, you were stressing the importance of our history, of our contribution to the war. And in certain regards, it seems that we have almost rewritten the history of what Canada's contribution was, or we seem to neglect certain components or aspects of it. Some generations don't even have a concept or knowledge of the First World War, the Great War. How or what can be done to help entrench our history, especially with the younger generations?
If I knew that, I'd be a rich man. I suppose I'd be writing best-selling books one after another. But one thing that I think is very important is to remember that the core of history is a story. And to be able to tell young people that this is an amazingly exciting story, that the general tale of the survival of freedom down through the centuries is one of improbable victories against long odds. I mean, this point is easier to make about the Second World War. If it had never happened and then you wrote your great magnum opus, your Tolkien-esque trilogy, and sent it to a publisher, they'd send it back and say, you've got to tone this down. You can't, this Hitler guy is just too over the top. That was not going to go. Or the Battle of Britain, the margin of victory is too small. You've got to give the Allies some more planes and stuff, as opposed to, again, seeing this. And if you go to the World War II memorial, especially the one to the air war in Britain, and you realize that they have people from dozens of countries. I mean, of course, the British, yes, the Canadians, the Free French who'd managed to escape, the Poles who'd gotten out of the wreckage of their country by Hitler and Stalin. And the same thing is true of World War I, that this is an exceptional story of determination and ingenuity. And Canadians made important contributions to overcoming the trench stalemate, working out new ways of targeting the enemy artillery, better ways of destroying barbed wire, ways to push forward that didn't get bogged down when the defenders rallied. There's all kinds of ingenuity, and there are all kinds of stories of individual heroism. And
right.
So to get young people excited is to tell them that you are part of an amazing tale that is not over, that the great deeds have not all been done. The idea of faith and honor is not dead. The notion of truth is not dead, and that these people fought and died so that you would have something to believe in and stand up for. And I think that's the right way into it. There's a line from the Narnia Chronicles where he talks about the history taught in Narnia under the usurper Miraz, and he says that it was duller than the truest history you ever heard and less true than the wildest adventure story. And what we have is a story that's incredibly exciting and is also true.
And
again, went back to Magna Carta, did a documentary on that too. So I'm there.
Okay, so then let's talk about the significance of the flag. Presently, there's a debate, a brew, I suppose, about whether the flag should be raised back up again and then lowered for in time for Remembrance Day commemorations, because it's been lowered since May 30th due to the discovery of these unmarked graves. What is the significance of the flag for Canada on Remembrance Day?
I think the flag, even though, of course, the flag that we now fly is one that is open to reproach on certain grounds, including that it was a deliberate attempt to erase our British heritage. But it is our national flag. And the maple leaf was one that certainly would be recognized by those soldiers. And again, it stands for peace and justice. It stands for faith and honor. And these things include acknowledging our mistakes, recognizing the things that we did badly, including in this very, very difficult area of race and of First Nations and the very real failings of the West. But we don't fly that flag because we don't have failings. We fly that flag because one of our great strengths is that we admit to mistakes. We fix what we can, we acknowledge them, and we learn from them. And I think it's high time to raise the flag back to the top of the mast. We have made another gesture of recognition of this painful part of our history. And I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to make practical changes. You can't go back and alter the past, but you could certainly do something about drinking water in remote Aboriginal communities. But I think the idea of keeping it down forever says that it wasn't worth it, that those soldiers did die in vain, including Aboriginal soldiers who went and volunteered, and many performed heroically and then came home to mistreatment. This is a terrible thing.
Very terrible.
But as with Martin Luther King in the United States, he refused to believe that the Bank of Justice did not have sufficient funds. And I think that we fly the flag proudly because we say we will see what happened. We will talk about it. We will do what we can, and we will learn, and we will do better next time. The West doesn't claim to be perfect. It's acknowledging its mistakes that makes it great.
Okay, we only have a few seconds left. Where can people watch your film if they want to see it?
They can go to my website. That's johnrobson.ca, and then over to documentaries. Worst marketing plan ever. It is for sale, but it's also available free. So go to johnrobson.ca and over to the right side, and there they are.
John, thank you again for all your wisdom and insight. It's been a real pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.